Good afternoon, listeners. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dennis Schoen, and I am the founder and CEO of Research Nutritionals. As the company is founded on developing targeted nutritional supplements and completing clinical research that is published in peer-reviewed journals, part of our company mission is to promote practitioner education with talented and creative practitioners such as today's guest, Dr. Taylor Krick, who practices in Central Illinois. Dr. Krick holds a doctorate from Palmer College of Chiropractic. He opened his first practice in Salt Lake City. And he soon became known as a functional medicine doctor who provides care for professional skiers, national champion weightlifters, and help thousands of people take control of their health. Dr. Krick's clinic was voted the best of Utah in alternative medicine. In 2018, Dr. Krick and his wife moved back to their native Illinois in order to be closer to family. Dr. Krick is an expert on lab interpretation, immunology, and metabolism, and loves teaching his patients to understand and take control of their specific health challenges. His favorite symptoms to help are fatigue, anxiety, bloating, among others, but he also really loves very complex and puzzling cases. He is also the host of the very popular Autoimmune Doc Podcast. Dr. Krick believes that with autoimmune challenges, or any other health problem for that matter, when you can understand the mechanisms behind the why you have headaches, why you are tired, when you understand the mechanisms, the solutions become more obvious. Today's discussion with Dr. Krick will focus on numerous roles of the mitochondria and the role they play in maintaining health, including energy creation, numerous roles in immune support, cell signaling, apoptosis, and the ability to impact so many areas of the body, including metabolic syndrome and aging. He will share with our listeners how he evaluates and revitalizes mitochondrial function, including the labs he uses and nutritional support that is targeted to each patient. To our listeners, I want to let you know that we will have live Q&A following today's discussion, so feel free to send your questions in as you're listening during today's event. Welcome, Dr. Krick. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure, and it's great to talk to a functional medicine practitioner such as yourself, who, as we were talking a little bit earlier, you spend usually a minimum of 75 to 90 minutes with a patient to really understand what's going on. You take that time to figure it out.
Yeah. And sometimes we joke, my initial intake is 90 minutes and then there's an hour follow-up. But sometimes we joke that it's not till the third or fourth visit that we really start to crack the case. So it's sometimes, and I've heard it said too, if you listen to the patient long enough, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. So I think that spending that time, sometimes it just takes that amount of time to figure out some of these mechanisms.
Well, and also I imagine it takes time for the patient to really elucidate why or the problems that they're having. And when you hear all the different issues, you can put it together.
Yes. Or if somebody says, I have fatigue, and I say, well, that could be a mitochondrial issue. And then I say, here's a list of some of the others. And they say, oh my gosh, I have that and that and that and that. Then all of a sudden they're starting to connect the dots. It's like, oh, it's my mitochondria that are damaged or need supported or whatever the case may be. So absolutely, I like spending the time with people, and I think that also a big part of what I do is education. So it's not like I'm just hearing your symptoms for an hour, but we'll talk and I'll say, okay, let me tell you what that means to you. I'll show a lot of graphics, I show a lot of studies, I show a lot of research papers, and just sometimes just to educate people, but also to say, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's the study. Or here's the other information that's out there saying how these dots connect, and they say, oh my gosh, this is starting to make sense. So like you said in the intro, when you understand the mechanisms, the solutions become a little bit more obvious. So we spend a lot of time teaching and understanding these mechanisms.
Well, that's great, and I'm sure your patients certainly benefit by you spending the time and asking the right questions. So good for you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we're going to be talking about the mitochondria today, as we mentioned. And so just if you could share a little bit with the listeners about the mitochondria, their importance, their role, which is obviously involved in energy, but even much more than energy.
Yeah. It's honestly, it's one of those questions. It's like, what do the mitochondria do? It's like everything. Or there's a movie called Almost Famous, and he says, "What do you love about music?" He says, "To begin with, everything." It's like that's what mitochondria do. But it's energy metabolism. So that's the energy to get up and get out of bed in the morning. And fatiguing issues are really common. I see quite a few of them. But there's also many things that mitochondria do that don't lead to fatigue. They produce inflammatory cytokines. They produce reactive oxygen species, and their blood sugar and insulin resistance and neurons, neuron triggering. I think that's one of the biggest things that people don't associate with mitochondria is neurons that are too easily triggered or fired, so causing neuropathy or pain syndromes or anxiety or dizziness. Is the neurons in the vestibular system telling you that the room is moving when it's not. Or tinnitus is telling you that there's a noise when there's not. Or fibromyalgia is sometimes telling you there's a pain when there's not anything there to be causing that. That's all mitochondria. And they also, too, Dennis, I think that everything in the mitochondria, which is just an interesting, is electrical. They break down our food. Our body breaks down our food into electrons and protons, and then those electrons are passed through the electron transport chain in the mitochondria and then outspits this energy. So I think that's just interesting in the context of our growing non-native EMF fields that we're exposed to, and some of the mechanisms of that being mitochondrial or even grounding. Many people are familiar with the benefits of grounding or being barefoot or connected to the earth, and that's all mitochondrial. And then they also, too, kind of act as the antenna in our cells and sense danger and sense other cytokines and chemokines and kind of the internal milieu of the cell. They kind of sense that and then behave accordingly. And in fact, there's a concept called the cell danger response. And it's published out of the journal Mitochondria, so it's all the mitochondria that sense that. But the author of that paper, he says that when cells go to war, they behave the way that nations do. They harden their borders and don't trust their neighbors, and they stop talking to each other. And so the mitochondria are what do that, sense that danger and then send those signals out for the cell danger response. And those dangers too, just while I'm kind of rambling on this, are all the things that we see in functional medicine practice. And the outcomes of this cell danger response are also all the things we see in functional medicine practice. The gut microbiome gets disrupted, we get inflammation, we get autoimmunity, we get anxiety, we get neurotransmitter imbalances, we get depletion of cortisol. These are all direct quotes from these papers of the cell danger response. But the dangers are the things that we see in functional practice, like Lyme or mold or viral infections or toxins, or the things that are dangerous. And the mitochondria are kind of the antenna that sense that.
It's interesting. I mean, you're really talking about how pervasive in overall health the mitochondria are. Most people look at it from purely energy, and that's obviously a big part of it, because without the mitochondria, we wouldn't have energy. But it's so much more important than that, just energy.
Absolutely. And I think that, if somebody comes in with chronic fatigue, then we know right off the bat their mitochondria are impaired. But what if somebody comes in with anxiety and insomnia, and they have too much energy? Do they not have a mitochondrial issue? They absolutely have a mitochondrial issue. It's just not presenting in the same way. So there's almost no cases or people that mitochondria aren't involved with, because they're the batteries that literally power all of our life. The question is that meeting mitochondrial support, is that the best next step for this particular person? But almost everybody needs mitochondrial support in some way, but there's a lot of nuance to how you do that, I guess.
So when you're looking at your patients and going through the discovery process, are there certain labs or certain tests that you run that you find helpful in either confirming what you think might be going on, or detecting something?
Yeah, absolutely. I do a little bit of every lab. So even, and again, a C-reactive protein, you could argue that there's mitochondrial parts of that, a hemoglobin A1C, cholesterol, everything that we're measuring in the human body is by nature mitochondrial in some way because it powers our body. But to look specifically at that function, I use organic acids testing the most for that. There are other mitochondrial labs that are available. There's mito swabs and some other things that can be measured. But I use an organic acid, and I've really throughout the years I've dabbled with many different companies, but I'm really partial to Mosaics. And formerly Great Plains Labs. And I've spoken for them before and taught about how to utilize the organic acid test for chronic and complex patients. And so now I've run, I don't know if not 1,000, several hundred. We run over 100 a year, but now you get some expertise after looking at a high number of those to just see, is the mitochondria the priority? Sometimes people come in with fatigue, and I don't support their mitochondria. Because if the labs show their gut's a wreck and they have a high toxic burden and they've got high pathogen burden or things like that, then I might aim at other things. So I don't just arbitrarily aim at mitochondria for everybody, but it could be justified that you could, but I don't with everybody. But going back to the organic acid, and especially the Mosaic one that I can speak the most to, it can tell us a little bit more about some of these specific mitochondrial functions. So even within the mitochondria, there's things like the electron transport chain and cytochrome C oxidase, which is a part of that, or CoQ10 or the Q cycle, which is a part of the electron transport chain. And that's one important piece of mitochondria. But if that's not somebody's missing piece, then CoQ10 might not be their missing nutrient. And if it's more glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis, anaerobic, then it might be more carnitine or some other mitochondrial supporting things. Or if their problem is mitophagy, which again is really, that's hard to measure, it's hard to know, but PQQ or something might be more for mitochondrial biogenesis or mitophagy, or there's other mitochondrial supporting micronutrients that support these individual functions. So anyway, sometimes I'm using that lab to find the individual broken piece. Sometimes I'm using that lab to just see, do you generally have a need for mitochondrial support? People come back with 2, 3, 4 mitochondrial markers abnormal, that I'm just going to say, hey, you need mitochondrial support, and let's start with something like ATP 360 that covers a lot of our bases and just support their mitochondria in general. But we can also kind of see some of those energy metabolism changes. And sometimes also, they don't show up on labs. Labs don't always show everything. So that's going back to my history and my questions and how somebody's responding or what's working or not working. Sometimes we don't see any mitochondrial issues on their labs, so we might not start in that direction. But based on their symptoms or their progression, we might say, okay, I think we need to support your mitochondria. In fact, I had somebody like that yesterday. She got a lot of neuro things. So mitochondria. She's had concussions. She's had toxic exposures. Just kind of a complex history. But her stool test that she had before she met me was just loaded with pathogens. So our focus has been on that. But then yesterday during our conversation, she said, hey, this is improving and this is improving, but these things aren't improving. I get this hypoglycemia where I shake. She'll wake up in the middle of the night shivering, and she can't go very long without fuel. So she gets these hypoglycemic symptoms, and she also has some insulin resistance on the other end. So I'm just kind of even drawing for her on a whiteboard on a Zoom call, saying, this is fuel utilization, this is your mitochondria. I think your mitochondria are moving up on our radar of treatment steps. And I think this is an important next thing to aim at.
Well, no, that's great. I mean, again, the answer is not always the simple one. It's not the obvious one, right?
In my office, it never is. And even in my intro, it's like, Dr. Taylor loves complex patients, and I still do. But over the last few years, I've attracted quite the complex crowd. And I'm kind of like, okay, I kind of miss the simpler days. but I do love the complex, long COVID, mold toxicity, Lyme, just myriad of constellation of symptoms, let's say. I do enjoy those.
It's interesting because, we, we do talk to practitioners quite a bit. Excuse me one second. And what we've heard from so many is that it's a lot more complicated treating patients now than it used to be. And so you're not dealing with an issue, you're dealing with a multitude of issues, and that's what you're obviously finding as well.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. And it's not like, oh, we just got to fix your gut. Even, I was telling you the story before we got on the air about the guy with the parasite. We're going to get rid of that parasite, and he's going to be better, and it's going to be easy. And I don't see that many of those. Occasionally we do, but a lot of times it's more like the triage of what do we need to do first? What do we need to do second? What do we need to do third? Because we've got 5 things, we have to hit them all. But if we do them in the right order, then it can speed things up as far as the progress that we expect.
It's interesting because you're working a lot with, it sounds like chronically ill patients or more complicated patients. And when you were in Utah, you were working with a lot of athletes or maybe even extreme athletes. And were you seeing that in either case that there may have been mitochondrial issues with, obviously both sets of patients?
Say that again. I'm sorry, Dennis. I was looking at this mic, trying to fix this mic. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. I think we're getting some audio issues, some feedback, and the echo that I can hear, I think that you guys can hear it as well.
Okay, so we okay now?
Can you hear me still?
I can hear you. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. I can just also hear my echo, but I got a message that the echo was coming through on your end now too. So, but ask your question again. I apologize.
We're checking one more thing out to see if we can stop the echo.
Okay.
Hang on just a moment. I apologize.
I hear that double echo again.
We're making progress.
Hello?
Listeners, I apologize. We'll get this worked out.
Well, yeah, I can hear my double echo, but I could hear it the entire time, but I was just talking through it. But I got a message that you guys. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let me ask you the question. So I was saying, you're seeing complex patients now. A lot of them probably have chronic issues that they're dealing with, or other serious health issues. And prior to that, when you're in Utah, you're working with a lot of elite athletes, and they were coming in to see you. And were they experiencing mitochondrial issues also, a lot of those people?
No, I wouldn't say then. But what's interesting is now in the long COVID era, I have several people who have been, diagnosed at UCLA or at different, they're members of long COVID clinics at different major universities and things, but high-level athletes. I'm starting to see that a little bit more. I've got a few that were, extreme CrossFitters or ultra marathoners or, were collegiate runners and things. So I don't know if there's a connection, but I think that the mitochondria, exercise can help, and it helps. One of the things that I learned even in undergrad with mitochondria is that we just want flux through the motor, so flux through your car's motor would be how many tanks of gas are you going through, and that's probably worse on your car's motor, but for a human and for metabolism, the more flux we get through there, the more efficiently that motor works. And that's where exercise is really good for the mitochondria. Now, also in the chronic fatigue world, a lot of people get kind of post-exertional malaise. So there's kind of paradoxical, signs of that. But no, to answer your question, I wasn't seeing a lot of mitochondrial issues in that population in that time frame of my life either. It was more performance issues or I did chiropractic at the time, so musculoskeletal issues or adrenal issues, gut testing, things like that. But I wasn't seeing a lot of mitochondrial issues in that population. And I don't know, just as I'm thinking out loud now, Dennis, I don't know if the exercise was protective. We know that exercise protects us against some mitochondrial long-term chronic degenerative diseases like diabetes, Alzheimer's, and just has more of a protective effect. But I don't know if that's the mechanism, but it is just protective, and I think that probably is the flux through the mitochondria keeps those mitochondria healthier. Exercise also leads to increased mitochondrial numbers, mitochondrial biogenesis, and more mitochondria, more batteries, and you need more muscle power. Like a sprinter, an Olympic sprinter will have a lot more mitochondria in their quadriceps than somebody who sits at a desk job or something, just from a sheer numbers standpoint.
Right. It's interesting because we work with some other practitioners who work with some of these like super marathoners. And so, these are people who are running a marathon every day for 7 days, and they're sort of beating the heck out of their bodies. And we know breathing creates oxidative stress, right? That's the way it's supposed to be. But it's this constant chronic inflammation and oxidative stress that takes place sometimes with athletes that may send them off too, depending on what type of sport they're involved with.
Absolutely, and especially from an overtraining standpoint, we do see that. Now, what's interesting, going back to the athletes, sometimes I will see, like I had this one person, he was an ultra marathoner, and he's back to where he's able to do, 40-mile, 50-mile-an-hour bike rides and do longer things than many people, but I think he would want to get back to 18-hour races and stuff like that. But it's interesting when athletes will find that their fuel utilization has changed. So like this guy that I was speaking of, he can go for a 40-mile bike ride just fine. But if he's got to crank up a hill and really put out some wattage and really get into that anaerobic, so sometimes we can see these signs, especially for an athlete, they're the only ones that really speak this language of when I switch from aerobic to anaerobic, I crash. And so then we have to explain that or try to think through what's going on with that from a lactic acidosis standpoint or from an anaerobic glycolysis standpoint. But when I always liken it to a hybrid car. If you have a car that can switch back and forth between gas and electric, well, if you're going on a 1,000-mile road trip, you're going to be on electric. But if you need more power to get off the line, you might switch over to gas. And if you can do that efficiently, that's the value of that type of vehicle. And the human body can do that efficiently too. And so the fuel utilization from an exercise standpoint is really important. And then the other one would be if somebody goes hypoglycemic, which we were talking about, some of those with my client from Norway yesterday. But if somebody can't go 4 hours without eating, that's fuel utilization. You've got fuel utilization issues. You're not able to tap into, your checking account might be depleted and you're not able to tap into your savings account. And so we want that fuel utilization, whether it be sprinting up a hill on a bike or it be trying to intermittent fast. I've seen people with known mitochondrial issues, diagnosed mitochondrial issues, who try to intermittent fast. I had a guy, he went 16 hours, he had to go home from work. For most people, that's nothing. Like, I don't even know that I would notice if I went 16 hours. And I'm not bragging, I'm just saying it's just normal. But for him, it's like his whole brain shut down. And the brain fog was so severe that he had to go home that day. So that's just, again, just a sign of his mitochondria. So even if that, let's say on an organic acid test, let's say that nothing showed up. Well, if you have that sign or symptom, you got mitochondrial issues, and we're going to try to support those with mitochondrial things. And honestly, what we did, he's the guy that I'm talking about. He's the story that I've told you guys before, where he said that ATP 360 is really helping me. I'm taking one a day. That's the same guy. And so that's going to be my solution, or at least the first thing we try is, well, let's try supporting your mitochondria, and let's see if you can't go 16 hours without meals, or let's see if you can't go for a 30-mile or 30-minute bike ride or jog or something like that. And obviously with that, especially with the chronic and complex patients and chronic fatigue syndrome and pacing your exertion, I never push that on anybody. I just say, you got to try it at some point, and let's see how you do. And then with our consults, our follow-ups, it's saying, tell me what's working, tell me what's not working. People say, I'm able to go 30 minutes. Are we good? That echo just left, Dennis. We fixed it somehow. It's gone now. It's been there the entire time, and it just left. So sorry if that caught me off guard, but that's great. But yeah, so that's how we do this trial and error. We talk and we say, okay, what do we need to do? What are our focuses? And say, okay, let's try this protocol or these supplements at this dosage. And then we follow up again a month later, and I say, what's working, what's not working? And then we reformulate our plan and say, okay, here's what we're going to try next. And that's how we make kind of sustained progress with people. But all those things would be signs of mitochondrial issues that I would move that high in my list. If somebody's unable to tap into their fat stores, or unable to go long times between eating, all those to me scream mitochondria.
Right. Well, it's interesting because when you look at whether they're chronic disease states or excessive exercise, we're creating all that oxidative stress, we're creating all that inflammation, as we talked about, that that increased cytokine activity, and it's interesting that both of those those two issues, cytokine function and
reactive oxygen species.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah,
I know.
oxidative stress, or ROS. Anyway, both of those damage the mitochondrial membranes.
Yes, and they come from the mitochondria too, so it's kind of a vicious cycle, and hijacked or damaged mitochondria. And I'll tell people this, and they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds like me. They'll produce less energy, more inflammation, and more ROS, and then that in turn damages and peroxidizes the membranes. And I think that even just as part of the formulation of your product and things, especially ATP 360, that cell membrane and the replacing those lipids in the membrane, the internal mitochondrial membrane and the external mitochondrial membrane, but replacing those lipids is a really important part. Even with like Garth Nicholson and the lipid replacement theory, just talking about how these lipids get damaged and oxidized. Now, I also think too, Dennis, just while again I'm rambling on it, but you could do tests for lipid peroxidation of the cell membranes, and you're usually looking at malondialdehyde or MDA. And I only like telling people that because I see a lot of aldehyde issues, and aldehydes can come from cell membrane damage. Aldehydes can come from candida, yeast, or mold. Aldehydes can come from alcohol. The alcohol gets converted to acetaldehyde. And then these toxins, these solvents, these aldehydes damage mitochondria. They can store in the mitochondria and accumulate in the mitochondria, just continue driving this dysfunction. Or the last one, just with aldehydes, is my office that I'm sitting in. I had a big formaldehyde problem here. It took me 2 years to figure it out, and finally got a formaldehyde meter, and I thought it was mold and all these things, but it was from the carpet that we got. So it can be occupational or environmental, or it can be an endogenous source coming from yeast or mold or damaged cell membranes. But yeah, going back to what you said, the cytokines, the ROS just further damage the mitochondria. So it's can be a vicious cycle. Yeah.
When you are treating these patients, so tell me, I guess, since you brought up the 360, what makes you go for that? What other things are you looking for that you think that I guess the formula has that are unique that really help your patients?
Well, what makes me go for that? First off, I've tried many other brands, and I've told you guys many times that I love your products, but I always say Ford says they're better than Chevy says they're better than Toyota. Everybody makes good products, but you got to go test drive them. And I think that I've test driven this. I'm obviously a big fan of the peer-reviewed research, but I tend to show that to patients more. To me, it's like what's working in real life. And so I just saw it. I felt like it was more effective for people. So I think that the formulation was the first thing that, just attracted me to it of, the typical things like, I don't know, B vitamins, magnesium, and some of the micronutrients, microminerals, things like that, or minerals, I should say, but are in a lot of these different blends. But I think the membrane support, and there's just a few other pieces of your formulation that just when I looked at the label, I thought, okay, this looks like a good formula. But then I tried it and saw it helping people, and it's one of those things that in functional medicine practice, if you get a few good reports from something, you're going to keep using it more and more and more often. And so that's how things get into my tool belt and get more widely used. I'm open to trying new things. I try new things all the time. We carry like 500 plus items on our shelves. I point that way because I have a supplement store. But which ones are heavy in my rotation is based on the things that have the most testimonials and success stories and people are noticing and stuff like that. So I think that's what drew me to it. I think that I probably also, Dennis, from a company standpoint, and I'll be happy to tell you guys all the good things that I think about you, but it can't, first off, you were at a very reputable seminar was where I first heard about the company. And so then it was like, okay, this is something that I can get behind, or just everybody else seemed like they were on board with it just in my industry. And then I looked at the formula, and I thought, okay, this looks pretty awesome. And then it went to trial and error of trying it. There's been other mitochondrial supports or other just supplements where everybody, from what you can see, sounds like it could be great. But then when I try them, people just don't notice that much. And then they fall out of my rotation. But it's the results combined with the formulation. But to go back to your question, I don't think there was any one specific, piece of this as far as, the membrane restore or I'm looking at the back of the label, or the lipid concentrate or anything like that. It was just how it had a little bit of all those things, but it wasn't just the B vitamins and CoQ10 and selenium and vitamin E. It was the membrane support and some other factors like that as well.
Well, no, it's interesting because when we started the company, there were two things we wanted to accomplish. One was to raise the bar on backing up products with research and getting it peer-reviewed published. But the other important thing, and this is really what matters from a patient standpoint, is getting patients better, or making, at least improving their health.
Yes.
And so rarely have I ever seen a single ingredient solve a problem. The body's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, exactly.
And the types of patients you're dealing with are even more complex. So, the approach we use is the multiple mechanisms of action in every product that we have. So it's interesting, we repair the mitochondrial membranes with that, but there's a lot of cytokine activity we talked about within the mitochondria. So we have an anti-inflammatory in there as well. And, it showed a significant reduction, and statistically significant reduction in TNF-alpha.
Right, yeah. And I'll show that, like your literature, I'll show that to my patients, and they're just because the graphs are just visually easy to understand, and you see the reduction in fatigue and things like that. They're like, "Yep, I want to try that." So it's an easy sell to get them to try it. But anyway, I think that there's multiple mechanisms of action, like you said, and then also too, just even. I know your kind of purpose statement for the business and things like that was you saw a lot of people over promising and under delivering. And I try to say in my practice, we try to under promise and over deliver. It's not even like, even though there's not one single ingredient, it's not like one product is likely going to change your life either.
Right.
But it's combined with these other things, with cytokine activity or fixing the gut or reducing the toxin burden or all those things. But along the way, we want to see that we're nudging the needle. But it's probably not going to be the end-all, be-all miracle solution from one product. But this comprehensive approach absolutely can be.
Right. And I think that's important, and that's maybe why you're seeing the benefits. I mean, we have a question from one of our practitioners asking, in your practice, if you're using that product, ATP 360, how long does it take? I'm sure it probably varies by patient. That's what they're asking.
So if people ask that, I say that is the $1 million question. And because, take for what, to restore lab values or to make noticeable impact. For some people, it's a day or two for noticeable impact. Like, hey, I think I like that. For most people, I say, even if we're gonna, weigh our options, I say, let's get through a bottle and see how you feel. I had somebody yesterday where, when she came into me, based on her signs, based on her symptoms, I said, you have mitochondrial issues, and I want you to start taking ATP 360. And then we ran labs, and so that takes, maybe took a month or 6 weeks for her to get them sent in and things like that. I think it took her a little while longer. And yesterday we were going through her labs, which had other issues, gut issues and toxin burden and things like that. So we're kind of moving into that. And I said, we still need to support your mitochondria, but I'm going to leave that one up to you. Our focus is now gut and toxins. She said, no, I want to stay on that. So sometimes I let people decide, and more often than not, they say, no, I think I want to stay on that. I think I feel a difference from that. I think that I'm noticing something. So that's the question: is what's the expected outcome? And I'll tell people with this too, like, how do we know when your mitochondria are healed? Who's are perfect? Nobody's are perfect, or what does healed mean? Or same thing with your gut, or your body has 400 trillion viruses. How do we know when we've knocked out enough of them? Well, if you're doing better, or if we're aiming at a lab target, then a follow-up lab. But the question of how long do you have to do it is a really, really big one. It kind of depends on how quickly somebody's getting better. I have a lot of people that after a month of doing supplements, they're like, hey, I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. So, and I don't want to say they're not perfect, but they're just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and their motivation isn't as high. And I have others where 6 months down the road, we might still have a high need to work on things. So I just think that varies so greatly by patient. And again, going back to those realistic expectations, the only time you're going to let somebody down, I've heard it said like this: if you run a marathon with a friend and you're like, how's it going to be? They're like, it's going to be fine. You're going to hate that person at the end because it's not fine. But if somebody tells you, it's going to be hard, your toenails might fall off, you might get blisters, but when you cross that finish line, you're going to feel such a sense of accomplishment, then you're going in with realistic expectations. It's going to be hard, it's going to be long, but it's going to be worth it. And so I think the same thing with the patients is, as long as you don't mislead them and say, hey, by healing your mitochondria, we're going to fix your dementia or something, even because it's a mitochondrial issue. If you don't overpromise, then people are fine to put the time in for that. But I would also say too, if I get to a certain time frame of, let's say it's 60, 90 days, or let's say 2 or 3 bottles of a product, and I'll say, do you feel like that's still nudging the needle? And if they say no, then I'm going to switch up, sometimes just for the sake of switching up or getting something where they feel. So we'll give it a good concerted effort. We don't switch off of that quickly. But that's a really hard question to answer as far as the timeline or the dosaging, or how aggressive do we need to be, and for what time. That's the $1 million question in functional medicine.
Oh, well, I'm sure. And again, because every patient is different, and they've come in with a multitude of issues, and then it's just trying to sort of unpack it and decide where is it you're going to start.
If we do an organic acid test and somebody has a lot of mitochondrial markers, then it makes me a lot more confident that mitochondrial support is probably going to be our solution. It's just a matter of at what dosage and what time frame and things like that. But if somebody comes in and they've got 8 different problems, and it's like, well, gosh, at some point we're going to see signs that your mitochondria are improving, but we've got to check off this or check off that. But it is just pretty different for everybody. Our goal with everybody is do it as fast as possible. But budget and compliance and just, burnout, and then just healing takes time. I mean, just, if you've been exposed to toxins for 30 years, you're not going to remove those in 30 days. But it doesn't take as long on the reverse end as it does on the front end. If you've been exposed to toxins for 30 years, it might take 6 months to see great results or something. It's not nowhere near as long as 30 years, but it's also not that quick either.
Right.
So I hope I answered that question, even though I dodged it a little bit. But it's just a I don't know, custom for every single person, I would say.
Sure. One of the doctors is asking, since you brought up mycotoxins, Are you using glutathione at all to help with that? And
I use, in the words of Dr. Ann Corson, I heard her say this one time, I use copious amounts of glutathione. So
I think
we
I've heard
use
her
a
say
lot
that
of
too.
we love glutathione. We use copious amounts of glutathione, and even for me personally, glutathione's been a part of my journey with mold and other things, even sinus wise and stuff. But yes, we use a boatload of glutathione. Yeah, and try Fortify. Even my last, so I'll tell you about my last person that I was just with right before this podcast. Met her last year. Have not followed up with her that often, which is, we leave it, we don't want people to slip through the cracks, but we also ask people, when do you want to follow up again? We kind of let them determine their motivation. But she said, I'm light years better than I was when I met you. And what we did last spring when I met her, we did some tests, we did organic acid tests, we did gut tests, we did gut protocol. But she has these insane sensitivities to airborne toxins, but also airborne gluten. She's a chef and she works in a nursing home, and they make 600 meals a day. So there's like flour and things, and she wears a respirator and a hazmat suit. But anyway, as we talk today, I said, I think our focus needs to shift out of gut healing and leaky gut. You've got this airborne loss of tolerance, because she said she also gets it around perfumes and cooking fumes and other airborne toxins. And so we started on some liver support and a binder and Fortify glutathione. And we just try to keep it simple with those three things: a liver support, Fortify, and a binder, just to keep things simple. But anyway, that I use it all the time for tolerance, for toxins, for all those things, I guess. Yeah, I really use glutathione for a little bit of everything. We call it liquid gold. And we have so many people that I have so many people that like maybe I saw them for the first time 2 or 3 years ago, but they're like, I think I want to stay on that one. And so they might stay on it, and they might not use it every single day, 365 days a year, but they're like, I want to keep that one around for if I'm starting to feel run down, or if I get an infection, or if I get sinus issues, I'll take glutathione, and it's pretty quickly helps those. Glutathione is the master protector of our barriers. Most people don't know this, but our sinuses and lungs have more glutathione per cell than any cell. They also do more cytochrome P450 activity than any cells, including the liver, because they're our frontline defense against these toxins. The liver as an organ does the most detox because it's big and it's just got a lot of cells. But these cells of our barriers have more glutathione and more cytochrome P450 activity. So I'm a big fan of glutathione.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I know that there's been a lot of discussion with people if they have oxygen, thirst and that type of thing too, that, we've heard that glutathione certainly helps with that.
Yeah, and I've seen that as well. And there's different mechanisms for that, but there's clearly a mitochondrial component to that, just with the other constellation of symptoms that often comes with. But it's interesting. And even going back to oxygen, I saw somebody yesterday, and he's doing great. His mom said he hasn't done this great in a long time. He has a mitochondrial issue. It's genetic. He's nonverbal, and he's not autistic. But it's in that kind of category. But they go to Colorado to ski every year, and she says last year he did horribly. And so I said, okay, this is what I think of with that. Is the elevation and the lack of oxygen is impairing the mitochondria. And so I said, he's been doing well on glutathione. And I said, as you approach this trip, you might just try doubling that up, just in hopes that this trip doesn't flare him or tank him or he has a seizure or things like that. But it's sometimes hard to predict those things. But if every time you go up in elevation, you get a symptom change, then I'm thinking, okay, oxygen, mitochondria. And it's the same concept with a hyperbaric oxygen therapy. It's kind of like a supercharger to a car, or turbo. I always get them mixed up, but it forces more oxygen into the mitochondria, which creates more combustion, and then can help heal the mitochondria through hyperbaric that's used often in mold, Lyme, heavy metals, head traumas, things like that. But yeah, I do think that elevation and oxygen requirements, or that air hunger, or things like that, are just quite interesting.
It's interesting. I was, one of the times I was skiing, I was at a high altitude, and I never have altitude illness or whatever that a lot of people get, but I remember being amazingly sore afterwards that day.
Exactly.
And so I thought, I've never tried this, but there was a hyperbaric chamber, that was nearby, a portable one. So I thought, I wanted to give this a try. So I went in there for like 45 or 60 minutes. Amazing.
Really?
I mean, pumping that much oxygen. And when I came out of there, literally no pain.
Yeah.
Absolutely zero pain in that short period of time.
That's super cool. I've never done one personally. They don't really have them in my area. And I've looked into buying one and stuff, but I don't have any experience with hyperbaric. A lot of my people that I see do, especially if they're in larger, more popular, population-dense areas, or some of my people have purchased them and bought them. But it's quite interesting, but I've never done it.
Wow. Yeah, there's so many different ways of approaching it. And I think, again, your ability to treat patients and really spend the time and figure out the puzzle, that's what makes you great at what you do, and probably makes it why your patients keep coming back.
Yeah, well, I thank you, and I hope so it is. I think that is true, but I hate to say, yeah, that is true. And pat my own back, but I mean, we have we don't do a lot of marketing. We have a referral-based practice, and even from the education that I put out on my Instagram and podcasts and things like that, that's what attracts people to our office is just the education of this connects to this, connects to this, connects to this. So the action steps are that we just need to address this and this and this, and we should see results. And so just explaining the logic of that and the mechanisms behind that, and then again the expectations of, this isn't going to say that everything's going to be rainbows and sunshine, but giving people realistic expectations for where they're at. I do think that most people are really, really happy with our care and happy with our approach and things, but it is this comprehensive approach. And then even, showing people, again, graphics of like, this is what a healthy mitochondria needs. It needs oxygen. So if you live at the top of Pikes Peak, that's going to be a problem. Or if you're anemic, that's going to be a problem. Or if you have Raynaud's or some autoimmunity impairing your blood flow, that's going to be a problem as well. Or even other, signs or symptoms of that. It needs steady fuel. So that's blood sugar if you need to eat more regularly, or are you able to tap into those backup fuel sources, or transition into ketosis or things like that, so that the mitochondria can use ketones for fuel. But your mitochondria need steady fuel source. They need stimulation, which I don't think most people struggle with today, but they need stimulation. Your brain, even from an Alzheimer's dementia memory standpoint, reading, doing math, doing Sudoku, crossword puzzles, and just challenging those things. And then lastly, what are the things that uncouple the mitochondria? And it's inflammation, autoimmunity, and environmental toxins. And I'll often tell people, toxins are toxic because they damage the mitochondria. So if you take cyanide, it's going to shut down your mitochondria immediately and you're going to die. If you take mercury or lead or glyphosate or mycotoxins, it's going to shut down your mitochondria slowly over time and you're going to die slowly. But they're both toxic because they're impacting the mitochondria. That is, and there's other mechanisms, but it's mostly that's the mechanism.
Wonderful. Well, we have a couple questions. Jill, can you move it so I can't see that? Perfect. So one of the questions is, I took the 360 product when I had Lyme. I was taking many other supplements. It was difficult to know for sure, but I feel this one made a big difference. It seemed if I missed a couple of days, I didn't feel as well. I don't have any symptoms of Lyme anymore, but I've been thinking about taking this again. Can I take this without actually knowing if my mitochondria needs improving right now? Would there be a reason it wouldn't be recommended?
Not that I know of. You might know more than me, but I would absolutely try that. I think that even if it's just for the trial and error, and like you said, you don't need maybe the full protocol that you were on. That was sometimes hard to know what nudged the needle. But if you're doing better now and you just want to do some trial and error, there's no harm in taking mitochondrial support for the rest of your life that I know of, as far as even the doses and things like that. And just again, the diseases of chronic aging are all mitochondrial. Diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, those are all mitochondrial. So there's no harm or risk taking this long term that I'm aware of, Dennis. You've maybe seen more with that, but I don't, just even looking at the formulation and stuff, I don't think there would be, even from a B vitamin standpoint or anything. So would you think so? I think there's no harm, and I think it's worth a shot, and I think you should try it. And then just see, like you said, the person who asked the question, just maybe do a week on and then do a week off and see, is this nudging the needle?
Right.
And then my other thing too, which might not be for this question, for this caller, but Dennis, I've told you this, that if, let's say you take, the recommended 3 a day, and if you don't feel like it's nudging the needle, I would up it. And that might not be something you need to sustain, but just to see, does it nudge the needle? Sometimes the recommended dosages of a supplement aren't doing it. And I told you even before, one of my mentors, Dan Kalish, I haven't done a lot of Dan Kalish stuff. A lot of functional medicine people do. He's got a great educator, a great teacher and stuff. But at a seminar I was at one time, he said, mitochondrial supports work as long as you don't underdose them.
Right.
So I do think that if for that person, if 3 wasn't, do you feel like it wasn't nudging a needle, and you did a week on and then you did a week off, you say, I feel about the same, I would up it to maybe 2 twice a day, or just try some other dosage, and I would feel comfortable recommending that. Now obviously whoever's asking can do their own trial and error and work with a practitioner if you're not a practitioner, but I think it's safe to increase that dosage just to get a yes, no, maybe so kind of answer out of it, and just see if it is nudging the needle. Because then I would say, for me, if somebody increased the dosage, and let's say they were taking, I don't know, I don't want to say any dosages that I would use, but let's say they did 3 twice a day, and they didn't feel like anything was happening, then I would not have them buy another bottle. So
Right.
Sometimes we're trying to figure out what's working so that we can figure out the next step. If it's February, then we're figuring out what we need to do in March. And if it's not working, then we're not going to keep doing it. But there's a lot of just experimentation to be had. And it also sounds like from that story, it sounds like it was helping. But how can you confirm that with being on fewer things? We'll just do one single supplement trial and error period and see what's helping or working.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a lot of doctors, I guess, in the healthy aging area who are using it.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, good.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things because we know what's damaging mitochondrial membranes, like you were talking about, with inflammation or the ROS or oxidative stress. And so if we have ways that we can reduce that, and there's clinicals on it, why not do it as their approach to it? And again, one product we know doesn't work for everybody, but we are hearing a lot of positive things, in that group of patients as well.
Yeah, and that's just not my world that I live in. But to me, I don't know if the limit exists. So if you could do it for the next year, you could do it for the next 5 years, you can do it till the day you die. And I don't think that you'd be overdoing it, because your mitochondria are always going to be exposed to damaging things, whether it's radiation or toxins or cytokines or foods or whatever the case, viruses, whatever the case may be. We don't sell plastic bubbles. So you're always going to be exposed to things that damage the mitochondria.
Right.
So that would make sense to do it even for long-term, just for healthy aging, even in the absence of any symptoms, the absence of any fatigue or neuro symptoms, just for healthy aging. I think it would make a lot of sense.
Sure.
Same with glutathione, I think, as well. The dosage might it might vary and things like that. You might not always need high doses, or it might be maintenance, or it might be times of flares or things like that. I do question a little more long-term antioxidants, because we've got this balance of oxidants and antioxidants, and messing with redox, I don't know, worries me a little bit. But I've seen great success from glutathione long-term. A lot of people take it long-term. I'm just a little more leery with redox balance. But I think those two things make sense for just wanting to live longer and live more healthfully, add years to your life and life to your years. I think both of those make a lot of sense.
Sure. There are a couple questions that are related, and these are from practitioners, about the order in which you're treating patients. So these questions are related to dealing with patients with mycotoxin illness.
Yes.
And they're using MycoPol, which is our binder,
yeah.
really for mycotoxins. And anyway, the question though is, should they have their patients start MycoPol right away, or should they wait until the mitochondrial health is restored first?
I don't know, and I don't again know. Like, the hard question is, how do you know when the mitochondrial health is restored? But for me, a lot of times ATP 360 is one of the first things that I use, after the history, before we have any labs. Let's say labs take a month to get back and get it sent in and things like that. So for that month, what are we doing? Well, a lot of times we're targeting symptoms from the history, the symptoms that are clinical presentations, and if somebody's, easily triggered by trivial stimuli or easily fatigued from stimulation, whether it be exercise or it be crowds or flashing lights or computer screens, or if somebody's got a lot of neuroinflammation, then I might start with Cytoquel and ATP 360. And then when the labs get back, then I might put them on a binder. Even if we can presume that there's mycotoxins, which a lot of times we can from a history, I wait until the labs come back and then I put them on a binder, because usually we're either, as kind of a next step, I'm either killing things in the gut like Candida or SIBO or things like that, and then I'm using a binder for that, or I'm trying to reduce mycotoxins or toxic load and I'm using a binder for that. So a binder is almost always part of my second phase. The question is, when does the ATP, do those overlap? And I think in a lot of cases those overlap. But like the person I was mentioning yesterday, I know some of these stories blend together, but we just got her labs back. We ordered them in December, so it's been 6 weeks since we ordered them, and she's been on ATP 360 and she really likes it. But now we're moving into detox, binders, killing things. I forget exactly what we did, but I kind of left it up to her and said, do you want to stay on this? Because from a budget standpoint, some people just don't want to be on 8 things at once.
Right.
Or some people say, that's nothing. My last practitioner had me on 15. This is nothing for me. So some people are completely open to being on 8 things at once. But a lot of times I'll let them answer that question themselves. Because if we've started it in month 1, then I'm saying, do you think it's helping? And just more often than not, they say, yes, I want to stay on it, unless it's kind of crowding their budget or things like that. Or we might, sometimes I'll discontinue something for a month or 2 months while we're focusing on something else, and then I'll bring it back. Or if we, if their mitochondrial symptoms aren't improving, then I might say, okay, well, let's go back on that. But I don't have really like this is first grade, this is second grade, this is third grade, and we've got to go through these in order. And it gets hard to talk about like how I use protocols and stuff, because it's really is, I hate to say this a million times, but it's really customized and personalized based on all those individual factors of, if somebody's getting supplement fatigue, or if somebody's, budget just doesn't account for that, or if we feel like something's not working, or somebody's at a plateau and we want to nudge the needle in a positive direction. But I don't have like, I support the mitochondria for 2 months and then I do a binder. It's a little bit of both. And I think that also, just going back to the mitochondria and hyperbaric, one of the things that hyperbaric, when it speeds up that mitochondrial flux, it spits out more toxins. So you can see that on like some urine mycotoxin tests, or like real time has shown some of these where when somebody starts hyperbaric, their toxins go up and then they come down because they're pushing more of them out. So I think that mitochondrial health and detoxification are hard to be separated. But I don't have like, I do one and then the other. A lot of times there's overlap. I'll often do glutathione binders together, but ATP is not always with either of those, or not always with a binder, but a lot of times it is.
Yeah, one of the other practitioners mentioned something similar to that too, as far as, I'll do a lot of these together. Another practitioner said that I often treat the biggest problem first.
Exactly.
Because if I can move the needle with that patient, so if it's fatigue, okay, I'll deal with fatigue first. Then I'll go in for the mycotoxins or whatever else it might be.
Exactly. And I'm being serious. I don't want to sound facetious, but it's if we nudge the needle in the first month, people are all in. They're hooked, or they're like, I know that we're doing something. Something is working. And so if we can get people to feel that, one of the things I hate in functional medicine is like, oh, it's just a herx. Like you're getting worse. And it's like, oh, it's just you're detoxing, you're herxing. It's just kind of an excuse for a lack of progress. And it's not, I'm not saying it's not factual, but we should see signs that we're moving in the right direction, or see signs that we're nudging the needle in some capacity. That's really, really important to me. But yeah, it is really sometimes hard to tell also. But that's also where follow-up comes in and things like that, to say what's working, what's not working, what can we explain from this, and how can we change our approach to make continued progress.
Right, right. Another question from another practitioner is, actually there were a couple questions on this relating to what a normal dose of glutathione is and what do you consider a high dose?
Well, I will sometimes reference a published paper in a study that says 1,000 milligrams of liposomal glutathione 4 times a day, and I tell people that's high, and I say that'd be hard to even sustain from a budget standpoint. You'd just be flying through the bottles pretty quickly. But I do think that that is high, and I do think that sometimes high doses are necessary. But just again, from the problem with that, there's all these things that I keep in mind that might not always be the right answer, but they're just things that I keep in mind. Is if somebody's going through a bottle every 2 weeks, it's just hard to keep them stocked on that. It's hard to keep the enough, and a lot of people don't want to buy 3 bottles at the beginning and then have those just for the first month. So I'll try to make the bottles last a while, but also try to be effective. So if somebody has a lab value that indicates a need for glutathione or high levels of toxins or mycotoxins, I would dose Trifortify at 2 to 3 times a day. And I'll tell them, and I'll write that on their write-up. I'll say, I don't say has to be 2 3 times a day, has to be 3 times a day. I say, experiment with this. And then when we talk, they'll say, I tried that 2 times a day, and I think it helped me more than 1 time a day. So well, good. How about let's try 3, and just kind of experiment and play around. But a lot of times I'll use the recommended doses that's on your label because that's what people get home and they're like, how much am I supposed to take? So I'll have people take the recommended dosage. I just might have them take it 2 or 3 times a day. And my understanding too is glutathione and the absorption and things like that, and it's better to take it in divided doses than in one big bolus at the beginning or end of the day. So that's what I'll do is I'll use the 5 mLs, but I might do it 2 3 times a day. And I might do sometimes, like with Trifortify, I might do for the first bottle 2 times a day. So that's going to last 24 days. And then I might just say, hey, after this bottle, let's go down to 1 time a day and make it last a little bit longer. And then they're like, yeah, I'd like that too. That sounds good. But we're front loading. I will front load antioxidants and use some higher doses. For me personally, I had glutathione and I was taking a very, 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 very high dose, and it was noticeable for me, much more noticeable. So I use the metaphor a lot. We don't want to shoot a bear with a BB gun. It's the right weapon, but it's the wrong caliber, and it's not going to do anything. So sometimes you need to just boost that up, but that shouldn't be a forever thing. So I'll do it again, 5 mLs 2 3 times a day, which is, I got it here, 450 milligrams, 2 to 3 times a day.
Sure, sure. There's another question regarding a patient who doesn't sweat, and they want to know.
It's a good one.
Yeah, how does it affect the process of actually detoxing the mycotoxins?
I have a lot to say about that. First off, it does, but it's also just a sign that they're toxic, and that will 100% change. That will change through detox, through sometimes those people that don't sweat, if you put them in a sauna, they get anxiety, they get panic. That it's not always a good idea, but those sweat patterns will change. I have one client in Florida. His wife, actually, she's one of the ones I was thinking of as we were talking. She has a hyperbaric chamber. She's really knowledgeable. She's a practitioner. And I can always see it in the background of her Zoom calls. She's super sharp. But her husband, he didn't sweat. He lives in Florida, so it's hot all the time. But he doesn't sweat. Then he saw some other practitioner, and they started, supporting his adrenals and his gut health and just kind of some, I don't want to say basic things, but important things, but kind of basic things. And he started sweating. Then something happened with that practitioner where they didn't keep up the communication, or something happened where he fell through the cracks and he stopped seeing him, stopped taking the supplements. Sweat went away again. Then when he and I started, sweat started again. So I see that all the time. I had one person one time, he sat in a sauna, not my sauna, but he sat in a sauna for 90 minutes with a ski coat on, and he didn't sweat.
Oh my God.
And it's just like, okay, so, and the metaphor that I use for that is, imagine if we pulled a fire alarm in a restaurant, and only 3 of the 4 doors are open. There's only a few ways we can get rid of toxins. We breathe them out, we pee them out, we poop them out, we sweat them out. And so if only 3 of those doors are open, then you're just not getting the people out as efficiently. So we open up that 4th door, and all of a sudden things are happening. Now, I can't say that it's like, oh, every time I use Trifortify or every time I use ATP 360, that turns sweat back on. But as we just lower somebody's toxin burden, 3 months down the road, there's a great chance that their sweat's going to change. Glutathione is also another thing that people will notice their sweat change or their odors change. A lot of people, their significant other will notice it, and they're like, "You stink! Like you're flushing something out through your body odor and through your bowels, and they just smell different." And then that will go away as we're reducing toxin burden. So I think that both of those are just interesting. But if somebody comes to me and they're like, "I don't sweat," immediately, just in the context of like gut and food sensitivities or toxins, immediately I'm going toxins. But then I'm also, using labs to not just jump to my biases, but I'm always moving around and doing, musical chairs with my differentials of what's the top priority, and things are always shifting and changing. But that's one of the symptoms that makes me think toxins.
Right, right. Well, wonderful. I think we're out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Krick, for taking the time to speak to your fellow practitioners on the line. And
well, we kind of predicted this, Dennis, but I could keep going for another couple hours. I mean, we're just hitting our stride now. But it has been fun. It's been great, and I love the topic, of course, and love just talking about the application of the products, and love telling the stories and stuff. So I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate you guys having me on.
Well, again, it's our pleasure, and thanks for sharing your expertise. Have a great evening.
Absolutely. You too.
All righty. Bye-bye.